All right, next up we have our autofocusing manual focus lever down here at the bottom, but you're going to probably find an autofocus manual focus switch on your lens as well, as all of the modern Nikon lenses have. Now, in the original days of Nikon autofocus, it was just the switch on the lens, on the body. The lenses had no manual focus autofocus switch on them. And so if you have a Nikon, I would probably say keeping the switch on the body in the autofocus mode all the time is going to work for people who have modern lenses. If you want to go to manual focus, just go to that switch on the lens and flip the lens over to manual focus. Only if you are using one of those older camera or older lenses will you go down to the body and flip that over to the manual focus. The button in the middle there, I sometimes call the mystery button because it's unlabeled and most people don't even know that it's there. That controls the autofocus mode of the camera. Now, we did play with this earlier in live view, but it's a little bit different when we get to normal picture taking. And so the back dial, when pressed with the AF mode button, continues to change our focusing mode. By turning the front dial, it changes the area that we focus in. You will see this in the back of the camera if you press the info button. And so this is very important for the focusing system. So you press the AF mode area button, and then you will turn either the back dial or the front dial. So the back dial changes the focusing mode. The first option is AFS, single servo autofocus. This is perfect for subjects that are not moving around. And for any sort of stationary subject, the camera will focus on that subject, figure out where it is, lock in on the focus, and then stop focusing. And you can then recompose for your personal style of composition. The other significant different one is AFC, and this is where the camera will track a subject moving towards you. And so this is where it figures out how fast the subject's moving, how fast it's changing, and it tracks that movement back and forth. And for sports photography, action photography, you want it to be in AFC. And so if you are in the AFC mode and you do want to lock focus, so let's say you're focusing on an athlete that's moving around, but for whatever reason, maybe they're in a motocross race and their bike just broke down and they're trying to pick their bike up on the side of the road and you want to lock and recompose the photo, you can press in on the joystick button and that will lock the focus there so that the camera doesn't refocus as you recompose for a more interesting composition. Now, the other half of this is changing where you focus, and there's lots of options and some very good options on this camera. So by pressing in on the button, keeping it pressed in while you turn that front dial, you can change from the many different AF area modes that you see listed here. So let's go through these one at a time. The first is a single point. So there is a small little bracket, and it's going to focus, and you can move this bracket around throughout the frame. And you have a very wide range of areas that you can move this in. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. The next is a group of 25 points, and this is where the camera has a little bit bigger target. Now, for a subject that's moving around, a player on a field with, football player, soccer player, anything like that, basketball, this is the one that I would probably want to choose. I like to have a target about the size of the torso of the subject I'm shooting, or the size of the car, and this way the camera isn't trying to focus on other things, trees or referees or whatever else may interfere with you. If their subject is moving more erratically, you may need a larger group of points, like the 72-point system here. Now, with the 25, the 72, and going forward, some of these are only available when you have the camera in the continuous focusing mode. And so you will not see these as options if you have your camera set to the AFS single servo autofocus mode. We then have D153, which is all 153 points. And so this would be good if you were going to be photographing birds in flight where there are no other trees in between you and the birds. And so if you just have a bird up there and it's very erratic in its movement and you want it to look in as wide of area as possible for catching the focus, that's where you'd want to put it. So Nikon has its own 3D special mojo way of focusing. And this is where it will use color information about that subject to try to determine what the subject is and where and how its movements is working. And this is one of the things that professional sports photographers haven't fully jumped on board with because it's a little erratic in the way that it works, and it may or may not work better depending on what type of subjects you're shooting. how distinct they are from the backgrounds, what other subjects are in the way. And so it's something that I would say it's worth a try, see if it works for your type of work, but you may want to jump back to the D25, D72, or D153 area. And so it's not something that's totally guaranteed on working. We have a group point, and let me rant again here for a moment. This is just dumb. This is not a group point. This is 5 points. And so it should really be like D5. And so they called it group for some reason, I think back on the D4, whenever they invented it. And they call it group, and they put it someplace different, but it's really just 5 points. It's a middle one that looks to its nearby neighbors. And so this is good when you want a single point, but you want a little bit of help from the neighboring focusing points in case you're not able to keep your focusing point on it. There's nothing wrong. It's a great focusing point to use when you want to be very precise. And then there is the auto area. Now, auto area looks at everything in which to focus. And if you've been following what I've been saying, you might be having the question, well, wait a minute, John, isn't D153 the same as auto? Yes, they are both looking at all the focusing points. But what's different about D25, 72, and 153, while you are looking at a great number of points, you have one starting point that you get to choose as kind of the significant start point. And so with D153, you can choose any one of those points as the place that you're supposed to start. When you're on the auto mode, it doesn't care about where the points are. It looks for whatever is closest to the camera. And so it's choosing whatever might be ever closest to you. And so if you have a skier coming around from the right side of the frame, you can choose one of those right side focusing points, and it's not going to worry about the gate they're going to go through or a tree they're going to pass by. It starts with that, and then it tracks them. And so they're similar, but a little bit different in that regard. So once you've selected one of the models like S, D25, or 72, where it's not all the points, you will be able to use the little joystick in the back of the camera to move that focusing point around. And so you can move it wherever you want. And remember that center button on the back of the camera will recenter it back into the middle of the frame. So we have 153 focusing points. Let me go into agonizing detail about what's going on these 153 points. All right? So now, first off, I guess I have to put the little disclaimer. This varies a little bit with which lens you're using. So if you have an older autofocus lens, this information may vary a little bit. Feel free to dive into the 700 pages of instruction manuals to see exactly how your lens fits in this. All right, you'll notice that some of them are little boxes, some of them are little points, and some of them are squares. The big squares are the 55 selectable points. So there's really only 55 that you can select. And that should be enough. They're very close together. 99 of them are cross-type sensors. So the grouping in the middle and the far left and the far right are looking for horizontal and vertical information. That is the most sensitive type of sensors out there. The other ones that you see in here, the 54 ones that were not listed as cross-type, are horizontal type sensors, which means they are looking for horizontal information. They do not do well with vertical lines. Or excuse me, I said that wrong. They're horizontal sensors, which means they do well with vertical lines. They don't do as well with horizontal lines. Kind of a weird technology there. Okay, so we have 35 selectable cross-type sensors. So if you are going to pick a sensor and you want it to be able to catch really quickly, this is the groupings that you want to go for, either far left, far right, or in the middle. 15 of the sensors support lenses that have an aperture, a maximum aperture of f8. Now currently, Nikon has 0 lenses that have a maximum aperture of f8. However, they do have a number of lenses that are f4 or f5.6 that you can add a teleconverter onto, which puts them at an f8. So for instance, let's take the 500 millimeter f4 lens. Put a doubler on it, it now is an f8 lens, and it's not going to work with 153 focusing points. It's going to work with these 15 in the center. All right? And so if you were to have the 200 to 500, which is a 5.6 lens, you put a 1.4 converter on it, it then becomes an f8 lens, and these are the 15 focusing sensors that you're going to be working with in that sense. So 9 of those f8 are selectable. Those other ones are kind of invisible in between helper points, you might say. And there are 5, just basically the middle one and the invisible helper ones around it are ones that work with the f8 lens and are cross-sensitive at the same time. And so if you want to forget all these numbers, that's perfectly fine. What you can generally remember is focusing is more sensitive as you get to the middle of the frame. All right? So that's where your best, most sensitive sensors are. And in fact, the center one is rated down to EV -4 in its sensitivity. And this tells you how much light it needs to focus. Now, oh, I love to rant. I get to rant again. And so what does EV4 -4 mean? Well, I think EV minus, was it -2 or 3 is like full moonlight. And so does that mean the camera can focus even darker than full moonlight, half a moon? Maybe, because the whole EV -4 EV in my mind is thrown out the window because it really matters the contrast of the subject you're shooting. If you have a subject that has a focusing grid on it with a perfect black and a perfect white point on it, then that might be able to focus at -4 EV. But if it doesn't have as much contrast, you're going to probably need more light. And so it is a combination of the amount of light and contrast. In general terms, this camera is awesome at focusing under low light conditions, and you're going to have a hard time finding any camera that does a better job with the center point focusing. All right, so just in review, you got to press the AF mode area button on the side. You're going to turn the back dial for the different modes. Single for stationary subjects, C for continuous moving subjects, and then you're going to choose which focusing point you're going to use. I like single point focusing for basic photography, and for action photography, I prefer the 25-point system.